breakfast at Ashbourne Hall was supposed to be quiet. Some men buy a wife, others simply buy a broodmare.
Pack your trunks. You leave Ashbourne Hall before noon.
The scrape of silver against porcelain is the loudest sound in a dying marriage. The marmalade was tart, the tea lukewarm, and before the eggs had even chilled, my sister-in-law leaned across the mahogany and called me a broodmare. The Duke didn't shout. He just stopped chewing. Breakfast at Ashbourne Hall was not a meal. It was a daily endurance test. The dining room was a cavernous expanse of dark oak paneling and heavy velvet drapes that seemed expressly designed to choke the pale morning light. The air always smelled faintly of beeswax, damp wool, and the metallic tang of the massive silver chafing dishes lined up on the sideboard. Beatrice sat at the foot of the table, her spine rigid against the unforgiving carved back of her chair. She pushed a charred wedge of toast around her plate. Her stomach was a tight, sour knot, a condition that had become permanent since she married Arthur, the Duke of Ashbourne, 6 months ago. Arthur sat 20 feet away at the head of the table. Between them lay a barren wasteland of white damask, broken only by salt cellars and a wilting centerpiece of white roses. Arthur was reading the Times, the crisp newspaper obscuring his face. The only sounds were the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, the dry rustle of turning pages, and the sharp, deliberate clinking of Lady Cecily's fork. Cecily, Arthur's unwed older sister, sat precisely at the midpoint of the table. She was a woman constructed entirely of sharp angles and old grievances. She smelled perpetually of dried lavender and stale face powder, and she viewed Beatrice with the kind of disdain usually reserved for muddy boots on a pristine carpet. "The Huntons are expecting their third," Cecily announced. Her voice was thin, reedy, cutting through the heavy silence like a wire. "A boy, the physician suspects, though one wonders how he tells through all that maternal blubber." Arthur did not lower his newspaper. "Indeed. Yes. Well, some families understand their duties." Cecily paused to sip her tea. The china cup looked minuscule in her long, bony fingers. She set it down with a deliberate Times clack. Her pale blue eyes slid sideways, locking onto Beatrice. "It is a comfort to see women of good breeding fulfilling their purpose. The bloodline must be secured. It is the only thing that separates us from the common muck." Beatrice kept her gaze fixed on the embroidered hem of the tablecloth. She knew exactly what Cecily was doing. It was a game they played every morning, a slow, agonizing drip of humiliation designed to remind Beatrice of her origins. Beatrice was the daughter of a coal merchant, a staggeringly wealthy coal merchant, but a merchant nonetheless. Her father had bought her a coronet, and Arthur had bought an influx of desperately needed cash to save his crumbling estates. Close. It was a transaction. Clean. Brutal, I suppose, Cecily continued, her tone conversational, yet entirely lethal. That is the risk one takes when one dilutes the blood. You introduce uncertainties. A lack of stamina, perhaps, or simply a lack of utility. Beatrice's throat constricted. She took a sip of her own tea, but it was cold and tasted of bitter tannins. It caught in her throat, threatening to gag her. She swallowed hard, forcing it down. She told herself not to care. She had promised herself she wouldn't care. She was here to manage the household ledgers and eventually provide an heir. That was the contract. But the sheer, relentless cruelty of it wore her down. The exhaustion seeped into her bones. She just wanted to eat a piece of toast in peace. Just one morning without a war. "I am sure," Beatrice said, her voice sounding unnaturally loud, slightly strained, "that the Huntons are thrilled." Cecily smiled. It didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, they are. Lady Hunton is a marvel, a thoroughbred, unlike some modern arrangements, where one simply purchases a broodmare and hopes for the best." The word hung in the air, broodmare. It wasn't cloaked in a metaphor. It wasn't thinly veiled. It was raw, ugly, and dropped directly onto the center of the table, alongside the marmalade. Beatrice's breath hitched. A hot, prickly flush of absolute mortification crawled up her neck and settled in her cheeks. She didn't feel righteous anger. She didn't want to stand up and deliver a scathing retort. She just felt deeply, profoundly embarrassed. Her hands began to tremble. She dropped them to her lap, digging her fingernails into the rough fabric of her skirt, so hard it ached. She stared at a tiny brown speck of burnt sugar on the rim of her saucer. Her vision blurred. "Don't cry," she ordered herself. "If you cry, she wins. If you cry, you are exactly what she says you are. A pathetic, purchased thing." The grandfather clock ticked. 1, 2, 3 seconds. Arthur lowered the times. He didn't fold it. He just let it drop to the table, the pages crumpling slightly against his untouched plate of eggs. He looked at his sister. Arthur's face was a study in aristocratic blankness. He was not a handsome man. His jaw was too square, his nose broken twice in his youth from riding accidents, but he possessed a quiet, terrifying gravity. He picked up his silver butter knife. He examined the smooth, dull edge of the blade for a long moment. Then he set it down. It was not a slam. It was a perfectly controlled, deliberate movement. The heavy silver met the mahogany table. He missed the placemat entirely, with a dense, ringing thud times, that vibrated through the floorboards. "Cecily," Arthur said. His voice was low, coarse. It lacked its usual polished inflection. Cecily blinked, her smug smile faltering slightly at the edges. "Yes, Arthur." "You will go upstairs," he said, his eyes fixed on her with the unblinking stare of a hawk watching a field mouse. "You will instruct your maid to pack your trunks. You will take the carriage to the Dowager House in Bath." Cecily's mouth opened, forming a small, shocked, "Oh, Arthur, I..." "You will leave before luncheon," he continued, as if she hadn't spoken. "And you will not return to Ashbourne Hall." The silence that followed was suffocating. The air in the room felt suddenly pressurized, heavy enough to crush bone. "You cannot be serious," Cecily whispered. The color drained from her face, leaving her sallow, over a passing comment. "I am your sister. I have managed this house for 10 years. You would banish me for the sake of a... She couldn't bring herself to say the word again, her eyes darting nervously toward Beatrice. "A duchess," Arthur provided. The word was flat, factual. "My wife." "She is a merchant's daughter," Cecily's voice cracked, pitching upward into a shrill register. The mask of aristocratic poise shattered, revealing the desperate, frightened woman beneath. "She has no place here. She doesn't even know how to properly seat a dinner party, Arthur. You are making a fool of our name." "My name is entirely mine to manage," Arthur replied. He stood up. He was a tall man, and standing, he seemed to swallow what little light remained in the room. He didn't look at Beatrice. He kept his gaze pinned to his sister. "Have your things out of the East Wing by noon, Cecily. If you are still here when the clock strikes 12, I will have the footman throw your luggage into the gravel drive." He turned on his heel and walked out of the room. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind him with a final, echoing boom. Cecily sat frozen for a long, terrible minute. The only sound was her ragged, shallow breathing. Beatrice remained at the foot of the table, her hands still white-knuckled in her lap. Slowly, Cecily stood. The legs of her heavy oak chair screeched against the parquet floor, a sharp, ugly sound that made Beatrice flinch. Cecily looked down at her. There was no apology in her eyes, only a toxic brew of pure, undiluted hatred and profound shock. She looked as though she had been struck across the face. She didn't say a word. She snatched her shawl from the back of the chair and swept out of the room, her silk skirts hissing furiously against the doorframe. Beatrice was alone. The sheer, Overwhelming silence of the dining room rushed back in, ringing in her ears. She stared at the empty chairs, the abandoned newspapers, the cooling tea. She supposed she ought to feel triumphant. She supposed a stronger woman would feel a surge of vindication. The Duke had defended her. He had cast out the wicked sister-in-law. It was the stuff of penny dreadfuls and cheap romantic novels. But Beatrice didn't feel triumphant. She felt sick. She reached up with a shaking hand and touched her own cheek. It was burning hot. The insult times, Broodmare times, echoed in the cavernous space, louder now than when Cecily had spoken it. It hurt so deeply, so sharply, precisely because it wasn't a lie. It was the unspoken truth of her marriage, dragged out from the shadows and slapped onto the breakfast table. Arthur hadn't married her for her sparkling conversation. He hadn't married her because he loved her smile. He had married her because her father's coal mines generated £10,000 a year, and because Beatrice was young, healthy, and possessed of a sturdy, unimpeachable constitution. She was an investment, a means of production. Arthur's defense of her wasn't an act of chivalry. It was an assertion of ownership. Cecily had insulted his property, his judgment, and his authority. He had simply corrected the insubordination. Beatrice let out a sudden, ragged breath that sounded dangerously close to a laugh. It was a dry, ugly sound. She grabbed her linen napkin and pressed it against her mouth, closing her eyes. She felt entirely unmoored. The fragile, polite truce she had built her life upon for the past 6 months was gone, blown away in a matter of seconds. She sat there for nearly 20 minutes, listening to the muffled thumps and frantic footsteps on the floorboards above her head. The maids were packing. It was actually happening. The dining room door opened. Beatrice snapped her eyes open, lowering the napkin. Arthur stood in the doorway. He had removed his morning coat. He was in his waistcoat and shirt sleeves, his cravat slightly loosened. It was the most undone she had ever seen him outside of their dark, quiet, mechanical encounters in her bedchamber. He didn't return to the head of the table. He walked down the length of the room, his boots heavy on the floor, and pulled out the chair, directly to Beatrice's right. He sat down. Up close, he smelled of shaving soap, a sharp, clean scent of sandalwood, and lye, and something else, faint sweat, tension. He looked at the chaotic mess of her plate, the mutilated toast, the cold eggs. He reached out and pulled the silver teapot toward him. He poured a stream of dark, oversteeped tea into her cup. It overflowed slightly, a dark brown stain spreading instantly across the pristine white damask tablecloth. Neither of them made a move to wipe it up. "She will be gone by noon," Arthur said. His voice was quieter now, stripped of the terrible authority it had held earlier. It sounded almost rough. Beatrice stared at the spreading brown stain. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did. She is your sister." Beatrice's voice was remarkably steady, though her hands were still trembling. She folded them tightly on her lap beneath the table. "She has lived here all her life. I am just..." She stopped. She couldn't say the word. It was stuck like a fishbone in her throat. "You are my wife," Arthur finished for her. He turned his head to look at her. Beatrice met his eyes. They were a pale, washed-out gray, usually unreadable. Right now, there was a tightness around the corners, a subtle strain in his jaw. "Do not pretend this is about me," Beatrice said. The words slipped out before she could stop them. The cynicism, the bitter reality she usually kept securely locked away, spilled over. "Do not dress this up as some grand defense of my honor. We both know what this marriage is, Arthur." She only said aloud what you and your peers think every time I walk into a room. Arthur didn't flinch. He didn't offer a platitude or a denial. He simply stared at her, absorbing the blow. That was one thing about him. He never shied away from the ugly reality of things. "I cannot control what society thinks," Arthur said slowly. I cannot control the snobbery of the ton or the viciousness of idle gossips, but I can control what is said at my own breakfast table, because it insults your pride, because it insults times you. The words hit the air softly, lacking any theatrical flair. They weren't romantic. They were stated like a fact, as undeniable as the weather or the price of coal. Beatrice frowned, her brow furrowing. She felt a sudden, confusing rush of anger. She didn't want him to be reasonable. She wanted him to be the cold, calculating aristocrat she had decided he was. It made it easier to hate him, easier to survive the loneliness of this massive house. I am a transaction, Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. She leaned toward him, abandoning her perfect posture. I am the soot on your ledger that made your balance sheet clean. Cecily was right. You bought me. Arthur looked down at his hands. They were large hands, scarred and calloused from holding reins and working the estate. He traced a line on the mahogany wood. I needed capital to save Ashbourne, he admitted, his voice devoid of emotion. Your father needed a title to secure his legacy. The contract was signed. Yes. He looked back up at her, and for the first time, Beatrice saw something flicker behind his eyes. Not love, but, perhaps, regret, exhaustion. But I did not buy a mare, Beatrice, he said quietly. I married a woman, and I am entirely, deeply, tired of pretending that you are anything less. Beatrice stared at him. The air between them felt suddenly fragile, like thin ice groaning under weight. The grandfather clock ticked. Upstairs, a heavy trunk slammed onto the floorboards, shaking dust from the ceiling overhead. Arthur didn't reach out to touch her hand. He didn't offer a smile. He simply sat beside her in the suffocating silence of the massive dining room, watching the tea stain soak into the linen. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a declaration. It was, terrifyingly, a beginning. The crunch of carriage wheels on the crushed limestone drive sounded like snapping bones. Beatrice stood in the drawing room window, partially hidden behind the heavy gold-tasseled curtains. The glass was cold against her forehead. Below, in the pale afternoon drizzle, the coachman lashed the horses. The massive black carriage bearing the Ashbourne crest lurched forward, dragging Cecily and her 4 steamer trunks toward the iron gates. There was no tearful goodbye. Arthur had not come out to see his sister off. He was somewhere in the West Wing, likely dealing with the gamekeeper or the bailiff. Beatrice watched until the carriage disappeared around the bend of the oak-lined avenue, leaving behind nothing but deep, parallel ruts in the wet gravel. She turned away from the window. The drawing room, usually oppressive in its grandeur, felt entirely hollow. The silence Cecily left behind was not peaceful. It was a vacuum, waiting to be filled. Beatrice walked out into the corridor. The house was unnervingly quiet. The servants were moving like ghosts, their footsteps muffled, their eyes averted. The Duke had expelled his own sister before luncheon. The hierarchy of Ashbourne Hall had been violently upended, and the staff were terrified of who might be next. She bypassed her private sitting room and headed straight for the library. It was the only room in the house she genuinely liked. It smelled of binding glue, damp wool rugs, and the sharp bite of coal smoke. More importantly, it housed the estate ledgers. Beatrice sat at the massive oak desk, pulled the heavy, leather-bound book for the home farm toward her, and uncorked the inkwell. She needed the familiar, brutal honesty of numbers. Numbers did not sneer. Numbers did not care about her grandfather's accent or her father's trade. A deficit was a deficit. A surplus was a surplus. She dipped her pen. The scratching of the nib against the thick parchment was a steady, grounding rhythm. She worked for 2 hours, losing herself in crop yields, timber sales, and the exorbitant cost of roof repairs. She found an error in the bailiff's tally, a discrepancy of 40 pounds in the sheep shearing accounts. You press entirely too hard. Beatrice jolted, a drop of black ink splattering violently across the page. Arthur was standing in the doorway. He had changed into a dark afternoon coat, though he still looked worn, the lines around his mouth deeply etched. He walked into the room, bringing with him the smell of wet wool and pipe tobacco. "I apologize," he said, glancing at the ruined page. "I did not mean to startle you." Beatrice grabbed a blotter and pressed it over the ink spill, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "I was concentrating." Arthur moved behind the desk, stopping just over her left shoulder. He didn't lean in, but his proximity was a heavy physical weight. "What are you looking at?" "The home farm accounts," Beatrice said, keeping her voice even. She pointed a slightly ink-stained finger at the column of figures. "Mr. Henderson has miscalculated the wool yields, or he is stealing." Either way, 40 pounds is missing. Arthur was silent for a long moment. He looked at the ledger, then down at the top of her head. "Cecily used to manage the household accounts," Arthur said. His voice was low. "She refused to look at the estate ledgers. Said it was men's work. Filthy. It is coal that pays for the roof over this library," Beatrice replied sharply, the old defensive reflex flaring up. She snapped the ledger shut. "I am not afraid of dirt, Arthur, nor am I afraid of mathematics." Arthur walked around the desk and leaned his hip against the edge of the wood. He crossed his arms. "I know you aren't." He looked at her, truly looked at her, in a way he hadn't since the day her father had presented her in their London parlor. He saw the tight knot of her dark hair, the rigid set of her shoulders, the ink smudge on her thumb. "You possess a sharper mind than my bailiff, Beatrice, and a stronger spine than my sister." He looked away, staring toward the cold fireplace. "I am sorry for this morning, not for sending her away, for the fact that she felt entirely comfortable speaking to you in such a manner, under my roof." Beatrice gripped the edges of the heavy leather book. She wanted to throw his apology back in his face. She wanted to tell him that his protection was too little, too late, but the utter exhaustion in his voice stopped her. He didn't look like a tyrant. He looked like a man drowning in the ruins of a dying dynasty, grasping at the one solid thing in his life. "The stain on the tablecloth will not come out," she said quietly. Arthur's gaze snapped back to her. A faint, grim shadow of a smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Then we shall burn the tablecloth." Dinner was not served in the cavernous dining room. When Beatrice came downstairs at 8 o'clock, the butler, Thomas, bowed low. His Grace requested the meal be laid in the yellow parlor. "Your Grace." Beatrice paused on the bottom stair. The yellow parlor was a small, intimate room at the back of the house, usually reserved for informal teas. It barely fit a table for 4. She walked down the corridor, her silk skirts rustling against the wainscoting. She pushed open the door. A small round table was set before a roaring fire. The heavy silver candelabras were gone, replaced by simple brass candlesticks. There was no vast expanse of damask separating them. The 2 chairs were placed close together, angled toward the hearth. Arthur was already there, pouring 2 glasses of claret. He handed her one as she approached. His fingers brushed hers. The brief contact was warm, slightly rough. "Thank you," she murmured, taking the glass. They sat. The footman served a simple meal of roasted pheasant and root vegetables, then quietly withdrew, closing the door behind them. The silence in the small room was fundamentally different from the silence in the grand dining room. It wasn't a battlefield. It was just quiet. Beatrice picked up her fork. She took a bite of the pheasant. It actually tasted like food, not ash. "I spoke with Henderson," Arthur said after several minutes. He took a sip of his wine. "You were right. He has been skimming from the wool profits. I dismissed him." Beatrice lowered her fork. "Who will manage the home farm?" "For now, I will," Arthur looked at her over the rim of his glass. With your assistance, if you are willing. The ledgers are a mess. I need someone who understands them. Someone I can trust. Someone I can trust. The words settled between them, heavy and profound. He wasn't asking her to be a duchess. He wasn't asking her to be a broodmare. He was asking her for a partnership. I am a merchant's daughter, Beatrice said, her voice dropping, testing the boundary. My methods are aggressive. Ashbourne requires aggression, Arthur replied. He set his glass down. He reached across the small table. He didn't grab her hand, but he rested his palm flat on the wood, inches from her plate. An invitation. I do not care about the ton. I do not care about the gossip. I care about this estate, and I care about the people who depend on it. He looked into her eyes, the aristocratic blankness entirely stripped away. I entered into a transaction 6 months ago, Beatrice. I do not deny it, he said, his voice dropping to a rough rasp. But I am sitting here with my wife, and I would very much like to know her. I doing. I left one of us to go. Beatrice stared at his large, calloused hand resting on the table. The anger, the bitter cynicism she had worn like armor for half a year, suddenly felt incredibly heavy. She was exhausted from fighting a phantom war. She looked up at his face, the broken nose, the gray eyes, the weary set of his jaw. He was not a romantic hero. He was a flawed, tired man, trying to salvage his home. Slowly, Beatrice moved her hand. She didn't clasp his. She just slid her fingers forward until they lightly touched his knuckles. The skin was warm. Arthur exhaled, a long, quiet breath that seemed to carry 10 years of tension with it. He turned his hand over and loosely intertwined his fingers with hers. They did not speak of love. They did not make grand promises. They sat in the small yellow parlor, eating roasted pheasant by the fire, listening to the rain beat against the glass. The contract remained. The coal money remained. But as Beatrice felt the steady pulse of his thumb against her wrist, the transaction ended, and the marriage finally began. That concludes the turbulent beginning of Beatrice and Arthur's deeply unconventional marriage. If you enjoyed this raw, grounded take on historical romance, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Share this video with your fellow historical fiction lovers, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our upcoming dramatic stories. Let us know in the comments, do you think their pragmatic partnership will survive the judgmental eyes of high society? Thanks for watching, and see you next time.